All right. As I mentioned, we are continuing our study in Ecclesiastes chapter 9. I had to factory reset my tablet this week between Wednesday and today. So I'm hoping that, first of all, everything's going to work properly. And second of all, I don't remember what the font, how big it was or small it was. So if that's too small, let me know. I tried to side on the air of caution or tried to err on the side of caution and make it bigger than I thought maybe it needed to be. So hopefully this will work all right. Okay. So last week we studied on through verse 10 or so of Ecclesiastes chapter 9. Wanted to pick back up just real quickly in verse 7 just to note Solomon's observing man's purpose under the sun with regard to enjoying the blessings of this life. Go eat your bread with joy, drink your wine with a merry heart, for God has already accepted your works. He's speaking in the context of people whose mind and attitude is already set to serve God, understanding that all of this is just under the sun. Okay, that this is not a context that suggests that as long as you believe in God, you can do whatever you want to and you'll still be saved. That's not what Solomon's point is. Verse 8, let your garments always be white, let your head lack no oil. Sure that I've read some commentaries that attempt to make a literal application from this, and I understand the desire to do so, but ultimately this is a figurative sense. Okay, let your garments be white. There's throughout the Old and New Testament, the concept of white garments always is associated with those who remain faithful to God. Especially when you pick up in Revelation, especially the first 3 chapters or so, that idea of white garments is a key component of those who are faithful. And then let your head lack no oil. We talked about the concept of anointing heads with oil. It's a sense of honor, a sense of something that has been dedicated, set apart, something that is holy. And as a result, this speaks to verse 7 once again, in that God has already accepted your works. Well, those works, He's accepted them because your attitude, your mindset is one to serve God under the sun. And it is to that which Solomon is speaking in verse 8, to maintain that state, okay, to maintain that life. Verse 9, live joyfully with the wife whom you love all the days of your vain life, which He has given you under the sun, all your days of vanity. For that is your portion in life, and in the labor which you perform under the sun. Whatever your hand finds to do, do it with your might, for there is no work or device or knowledge or wisdom in the grave where you are going. Enjoy the blessings of this life and be content with them. Okay, whatever situation that may be, in the case of verse 9, living joyfully for those who have a spouse all the days of your life. And notice he says vain life, because ultimately these are the blessings we have here and now. Okay, these don't speak to the blessings we're going to have one day. This is all in the here and the now under the sun. And he says, whatever your hands find to do, commit yourself to it. Don't just do it halfway. Don't just do it as if you're going through the motions, but your heart's not in it, that type of thing. You commit yourself to it. And certainly that carries along the line of people who have been faithful to God. They commit themselves to God, and as such, they commit themselves to their responsibilities in this earth. Verse 11, I returned and saw under the sun that the race is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, nor bread to the wise. And this is as far as we got last week. He's pointing out things that go contrary to what you would naturally think. Okay, the race, you would think the swift would always be the ones who win the race. And one of the things we noted last week is that endurance often, especially in a long race, endurance is often the deciding factor. Not so much who's the quickest, but even in the shortest of races, focus and being aware of oneself and aware of surroundings. I mean, even in the shortest of races, you could be the quickest athlete out there, but if you're not really focused and you trip over your feet when you get going, it's all for naught. And so the race is not always to the swift, nor the battle to the strong. He's not saying that it's never. His point is that there are often times where conventional thought or conventional wisdom, man's wisdom, is often not how things work out. Okay, the battle is not always to the strong. In fact, often even in man's understanding. Often the battle is often to the smartest, not necessarily the strongest. Nor bread to the wise, nor riches to men of understanding. These two really go hand in hand, but at the same time, they're different. The idea of bread to the wise. Bread isn't so much the idea of wealth. Bread is the sustaining of oneself, okay, or the idea of not wanting for food. All right, those who are wise, they're not always completely full all the time. Okay, sometimes there are times in which they suffer need. Enter in Philippians chapter 4, all right, where Paul describes the fact, I've learned in whatever state I am, therewith to be content. Well, God doesn't promise that our bellies will always be full. That is not what God tells us. That's not what Jesus tells us. What he tells us is to trust in him. God will take care of the rest. That doesn't mean we're always going to have what we want or what we think we need. But God will take care, certainly, of our soul. Bread is not always to the wise, even though we think those who are wise should always have what they need. That's not always the case. And then he goes a step further in saying, nor riches to men of understanding. Those who are wise and men of understanding, in a lot of ways, yes, they go hand in hand, but in other ways they don't. The concept of wisdom is the application of knowledge. Men of understanding speaks more to the concept of those who are skilled. Okay, men of understanding isn't just the concept necessarily of wisdom. It's the ability to work with one's hands. One who is skilled, one who understands how things work. Okay, I think of engineers, for instance. Engineers, especially depending on what type of engineering they're in, they can make a very good living in this life because those are very specialized types of trades. Those are specialized types of education. Men of understanding, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're wise, they're just very knowledgeable. Okay, they understand things that work. They understand how to do things under the sun. Wisdom speaks more to a overarching view of things, okay, a more objective perspective, I guess you could say, whereas men of understanding is more specific. And that's why he says, nor riches to men of understanding. Because typically, especially in this life, men who have, or people who have special ability, special education, special understanding of how things work and the way they need to work and so forth, often they have wealth. Okay? People who know how to work the stock market, people who know how to run a business. These people sometimes gain wealth. And you would think that that should be the case all the time. But it's not. Then he says, nor favor to men of skill. Men of skill speak specifically to the concept of even narrower. In fact, in a lot of ways, I hadn't really thought about it before, but you almost see wise kind of being this broad concept. Men of understanding kind of narrowing in a little bit, and then men of skill narrowing in even further. Men of skill speaks to those who are skilled in battle, for one thing, skilled carpenters, very specific concepts. Skilled jewelry makers, skilled in those who, those who carve, put the intricate designs and stuff. What is that called? Woodworkers, or like in carving in jewelry. What would that be called? Craftsman or engraver. Okay, an engraver. All right. These people who have the very good skill in a certain thing. Men of understanding is a little bit broader, but skill in one particular thing favors not always to the men of skill. Okay, well, whether that be from the king, okay, you would think that the men of skill, the king needs these types of people to design his throne, to design his, whatever, his jewelry, his armor, whatever. Okay, whether that be for a king or for government or for anything else. But it's the concept of you have bread, riches, favor. These are all favorable things towards those who are wise, men of understanding, those of skill. Okay, it's kind of a narrowing down. You would think that all of these types of individuals would naturally receive the benefits of what they bring. Okay, their particular talents, whatever those talents are in application, you would think that they would have benefits that would go along with them, and that's not always the case. Okay, so from the race, the battle, bread, riches, favor, all of this speaks to man's conventional thought process and how in practice, on paper, sure. Okay, September the whatever, on paper, Alabama should beat South Carolina. But that's not going to happen, all right? That's not going to happen. It's the idea that otherwise, what would be the point of playing the game? Okay, what would be the point? If you knew ahead of time exactly who's going to win, and because on paper these people are stronger, these people are faster, these people are more athletic, so many championships, whatever. On paper, well, if you're just going by paper, then what difference does it make? But the fact is, and this is where Solomon comes in, time and chance happen to them all. Again, under the sun. All right? Just because somebody may be physically favored or on paper favored does not mean that's how it's going to work out. And there's an application to that. Before we get to it, anything so far through verse 11? Yes, ma'am.
Aren't we glad that God doesn't look at that? You know, I mean, we're to use the talents we have and things, you know, to serve
Right.
Him and all that, but doesn't matter what our standing is in this life. Matters
Right.
Not a bit.
Right.
You know,
Whether we're rich, we're poor, whether we're
swift,
Right.
whether we're strong.
Yeah.
You know, none
Yeah.
of that matters to God.
That's right. That's right. Yes, sir.
All of this probably helps us keep from beating our heads against the wall when we see that this man is swifter, but he didn't win the race. This man is stronger, or this army is stronger, but they lost the battle.
Right.
We are inclined to throw up our hands and say, why is this world so out of whack? And
Right.
Solomon says, yeah, that's the way it is.
Right.
Because strength does not guarantee the battle. Swiftness does not guarantee the race, because the overriding factors are time and chance. And that is in God's hands to whatever extent He keeps it. in His
Right.
hands.
Now, isn't it?
As in Proverbs, the lot is cast out by fire, but the outcome is of God.
Right.
We don't know how that works, but it keeps us from going insane from frustration.
Right, right. And, you know, isn't that what Solomon kind of speaks to at the end of chapter 8, that we notice that after viewing everything, he's like, what I figured out is I can't figure it out? You know, that ultimately, that out of all the wisdom that I have after looking at everything and trying to peer into what the purpose of all this is, and maybe a pattern that is set forth, or some kind of cosmic order that God has established to be able to figure out what's going to happen in the future, can't do it. You can't do it. And in a lot of ways, keep in mind, of course, that so far, the context of this has been, first of all, the idea earlier in chapter 9, starting in verse 1, 2, and 3, describes the character of man, and in particular comparing the wise, which are associated with the righteous, and the wicked, which are associated with the foolish, and describing the fact that all of them are going to die. This may not make sense, this may not seem fair, but that's simply the way it is because we're human beings. While we're alive, we have this opportunity to change, to make ourselves right with God. So, speaking to those who are right with God or seeking to be right with God, be content in this life. Understand what the perspective you need to have in this life is, and then to apply that, realize, and again, under the sun. Okay, from man's perspective. From God's perspective, is everything up to time and chance? I mean, does God just kind of roll the dice and see what happens? Okay? No, that's not to say that God ordains this person to win an election, or that God ordains this team to beat this other team. Okay, that's not to say that. But the point that Solomon's making is that from man's perspective, there is nothing we can do to predict this. God knows, because God's omniscient and He's omnipotent and He's omnipresent and He knows the future. He understands how this stuff works. This is all within His realm of understanding. It is outside of ours, because the conventional wisdom isn't what always plays out in real life. So from our perspective, time and chance happen to them all. There's a couple of times, in fact, I was reading one just last week. I can't remember who it was, but there was several times in the Old Testament where God pronounces some sort of judgment on, say, a king of Israel. And he goes out into battle, and in one particular instance, again, maybe y'all can remember, one particular king was out there fighting, and he had, who was it? He put on regular soldier's armor so he could fight, and he got hit by a stray arrow. Who was that? Was it Jeroboam? Who instead of wearing his king's garb and everything, he dressed up like a regular soldier and then was out fighting, and then he got struck by a random arrow. I was reading it for some reason. I forget. There was something specific. Some reason I was reading it. But anyway, I was thinking about that in context of what we were going to be talking about in Ecclesiastes chapter 9, that from our perspective, some random arrow, he just happened to decide to dress up like a regular soldier. Some archer, just randomly, God didn't force him to take his arrow and shoot it at a certain time in a certain place to hit Jeroboam. But time and chance, okay? It goes back to, in many ways, this is kind of where God's providence fits into there, perhaps, as Mordecai would tell Esther, as Paul would tell Philemon, perhaps this is why, okay? Because it's not within our ability to determine or define. This is God's realm. From our perspective, looking in on God's providence, time and chance. Okay? And to me, a lot of times, this is why, and of course, there's an ultimate point to why Solomon's talking about this, but this is part of that kind of confuses people. Because God's thoughts are higher than our thoughts, God's ways are more than our ways. Man tends to think that God should think like we do. And when things don't work the way we think they should, sometimes man blames God because things don't work out the way that they clearly on paper, this should have all worked just fine. Okay? The best laid plans of men and mice, is that how the saying goes?
The best laid plans of life.
Of mice and men?
They have to believe.
Yeah. All right? That idea is sometimes when things go counter to our predetermined idea of the way things should work, it's frustrating. And even as Christians, sometimes it's frustrating, isn't it? We have our schedule all lined up. We have things we're going to do. Or maybe something special that's happening that week, and then it gets blown up by one little thing. All right? And that's frustrating. We don't blame God, but that's frustrating sometimes. Time and chance. Okay? And a lot of times when something like that happens, you're planning a big trip or whatever, and the whole family gets sick and you can't go. Sometimes I wonder, okay, I just wonder, maybe if we had gone, something bad would have happened on the way. It's those types of things that you think about. Well, I wonder, why does this type of stuff happen? I don't know. God knows, and maybe the reason has nothing to do with you. Maybe it has something to do with somebody else. But it's ultimately from under the sun, from our perspective, we need to accept the fact that we don't have control. And isn't that really what this is about? Because that's what it's going to come to in verse 12, talking about life and death. That's what the ultimate application of this is that time and chance happens to everybody. The strong sometimes are killed by the weak. Case in point, who faced a massive Goliath? Okay, I saw his footprint earlier somewhere in the hall. Angie was carrying it around. I was like, what in the world is that? Or was that you? I think it was you. David, of course, David had God on his side. But from everybody else's perspective, again, under the sun, this little tiny dude killed this great big warrior. How in the world did he do that? Time and chance happened to them all. Okay, and it goes to show that you have no control in this world. You cannot predict. And if you could master everything. You could master the world. But you can't. Nolan, I saw your finger.
See, in the greater context, so chapters about death comes upon all. He's talking about death prior to this verse. He picks it right back up following. So I feel it's in that context, he's even talking about these things.
Absolutely.
We said oftentimes want to bring it down to who's going to win this game, who's going to do He's talking that bigger picture.
Absolutely.
So somebody may be faster, stronger, wiser. Suddenly they're taken from this life.
Yes.
And that's what's coming upon all of us.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, and that's why he picks up in verse 12. For man also does not know his time. Like fish taken in a cruel net, like birds caught in a snare, so the sons of men are snared in an evil time when it falls suddenly upon them. This is part of the reason why Paul, when he talks about in Ephesians chapter 3, Ephesians chapter 3. I'm sorry, Ephesians 5, about redeeming the time for the days are evil. It's in that same context he gets into talking about singing to one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, knowing the will of God. Okay? He describes that redeeming the time for the days are evil. Well, a day can't be evil. Okay? A day is not good and it's not evil. Men are good or evil. It's the idea that anything could happen within that day. And within that context of what Paul's describing, certainly redeem the time, make the most of it, because you don't know what might happen today. This might be your last. All right? This is the same type of thought, especially when he says, "So sons of men are snared in an evil time." It's not that it's sinful evil, it's that all of a sudden life ends, death springs, and it takes you. And from that perspective of it not being good, it's evil. Okay, because it's not a good time, it's an evil time. We're no longer on this earth. The idea that he describes here in verse 12, man does not know his time. Just like you can't know who's going to win the race, who's going to win the battle, man doesn't know when he's going to die. And in a lot of ways, if you knew, and I'm kind of working on a lesson for this later on at some point, but I was thinking about the concept of if every one of us somehow, some way, we were told not only when we were going to die, but how we were going to die. Well, how would we react? Okay? Let's say you had exactly 72 hours. Okay? 72 hours. Would we try to change our fate? Okay? We've been told exactly how this is going to happen. Will we try to change it? Try to avoid it? Would we live differently? Would we talk to somebody that maybe haven't been talking to because what do I have to lose now? Would we, how would we react? What type of reactions would there be? Because what's interesting about this is, doesn't the Bible from the Old to New Testaments basically teach us to live each day as if it's going to be your last? It's an old adage, right? And yet, that really is how Solomon's describing this, in the sense that, listen, you only have now. Okay? A living dog is better than a dead lion. You have this time to fix yourself. Like fish taken in a cruel net. You're just swimming along with the school of friends you've got, and all of a sudden, you're taken. Or a bird taken in a snare. So the sons of men are snared in an evil time when it falls suddenly upon them. Now, Solomon doesn't, a lot of times people read into this the idea, of course, they assume that the devil, whom they think his name is Lucifer. Okay, keep in mind that's not the name of Satan. It's in its own context. Lucifer's not the name of Satan. But the idea that he somehow runs the realm of death, and he's the boss of hell and Hades. Okay, that's not true. That's not true. And certainly Solomon, when he describes this, he's not describing that this snare is laid by Satan. Okay, that's not what Solomon describes. This is all in the context of under the sun, life and death. That's what this is. So when he says here, the sons of men are snared in an evil time, it's not that God killed you, okay, or that Satan laid a trap for you and you died. It's that, again, under the sun, time and chance happens to us all. Okay, does God allow things to happen? Yes, he does. Does he have reasons for why he allows things to happen? Yes, he does. Can you or I know what those always are? No. Do we need to know? What lesson did Job learn? I don't need to know. Okay, we can speculate, but I don't need to know. He says, in an evil time when it falls suddenly upon them. And ironically, just in the same vein as death is described upon man. Okay, now granted, I mean, sometimes you based on situations of life and people's health and deterioration and so forth, sometimes you can see it coming down the road. Okay, but that moment, sometimes it just comes, and there's nothing you can do about it. Okay, but interestingly enough, the same type of language is used to describe the coming of the day of the Lord, isn't it? Like a thief in the night, suddenly. Okay? It'll be there. Very similar, and of course, very ultimately kind of the same type of circumstances, because when Christ comes or when I die, that's it as far as my state is concerned, isn't it? Is there any more chances to change or live differently after that? No. No, there's not. Anything through verse 12? Yes, sir.
I think the king you're referring to is probably Ahab back in 2 Chronicles 18. And the ironic thing is, he is actually told by the prophet in that same chapter, if you return from this battle alive, basically God hasn't spoken through me. So he does
I think that was
alter his fate.
I think that was what it was.
A normal soldier or whatever in a battle, and then the random hero happens to hit him.
Yeah.
But he has that foreknowledge and tries to change the outcome. Even that doesn't change.
That actually walked right into the
You can't fool God's plans, and the time and chance happens.
Right. Right. And I know it happened to several, there were several kings, and Jeroboam may have also been one of them, because I was looking at several different ones for some reason. And I do remember Ahab being one of them. And I think Jeroboam came up at some point. I might be kind of meshing the two together in my head, because I was looking at something specific. I wasn't looking at the whole context of it. So thank you. But it goes to show that ultimately God's plan's coming about whether you try to get out of it or not. Okay? And does God already know what you're going to do? Did God know that Jonah was going to try to run? Had God prepared a great fish to swallow him? Okay? God knew what was in Jonah's heart, what was in his mind. All right? God knows what we're going to do before we ever do it. He knows. All right? So trying to trick him or to throw him a curveball, to surprise him by something we do, there's nothing in the Bible that suggests that we have that ability. All right? Now, can God, or more specifically, like when Jesus was on earth, can he keep himself from knowing certain things? I guess he could if he wanted to, but again, there's no context or nothing that teaches that he does that. Okay? God knows. And so in the end, we have to accept what's before us and do what we're told to do. Anything else through verse 12? All right. Verse 13. So, just as Solomon has done time and time again, he takes something specific, like in this case, death, and certainly the opportunities. It's a warning about the ever-present possibility that death may come in a moment's notice. And he takes that and he applies wisdom to it. He says, "This wisdom I have also seen under the sun, and it seemed great to me. There was a little city with few men in it, and a great king came against it, besieged it, and built great snares around it. Now there was found in it a poor wise man, and he by his wisdom delivered the city. Yet no one remembered that same poor man. Then I said, Wisdom is better than strength. Nevertheless, the poor man's wisdom is despised, and his words are not heard. Words of the wise spoken quietly should be heard, rather than the shout of a ruler of fools. Wisdom is better than weapons of war, but one sinner destroys much good." So, after dealing with the concept of the brevity of, not even necessarily the brevity of life, but really the nature of life, in that we have no control. That's really what this is about. We have no control. Anything can happen at any moment. Why does he start talking about this city and this poor man, poor wise man, and delivering the city from the snares of the king? What's the point? Why does he go in? He says, "This wisdom I have also seen under the sun, and it seemed great to me." In other words, this is a great observation. Not so much that he's exalting his own wisdom. He's saying, but this lesson, the application of this lesson seems important. What is it? And how does it line up in the thought process? Go ahead, James.
It seems to me he's teaching us that we just can't predict what's going to happen, that things are going to happen that are unjust, unfair, unreasonable.
Okay.
Here's a wise man, but he was poor. So his wisdom is forgotten. You know, if he had been some great figure, that probably built a statue to him
Yeah.
down square. But
Right.
this is just the way the world works. If you want to learn something, pay attention to Solomon.
Yeah. But isn't it interesting that in the contrast, Solomon, being who he is a rich and powerful ruler. Okay? And yet in this story that he gives, the specific individual upon whom he's focused is the poor wise man. All right? And like you say, I think the key component here is the fact that nobody listened to him despite his wisdom because he was poor. And that's in contrast to verse 18, or verse 17 rather, the shout of a ruler of fools. Okay, these are contrasted here. So when he describes this, this little city with few men in it, it couldn't defend itself. A great king came against it, besieged it, built great snares around it. Everything within our human experience suggests that there's no way that that city could have survived. There's no way, right? Couldn't have happened. Yet, somehow, Solomon doesn't explain how, but somehow this poor wise man, by his wisdom, delivered the city. There were few people. People obviously listened to him, heeded his wisdom, did what he said, and somehow, whether it was by diplomacy or tact or skill or whatever, they were able to get out of this snare. Yet no one remembered that same poor man. So notice, certainly there's a lot of application here, but notice the different layers of this. You've got this city that shouldn't have been delivered. There's no way it could have been, and yet it was, through the wisdom of a poor wise man, but nobody remembered the poor wise man. What's the significance of nobody remembering him?
They're focused on right now what's right in front of me as opposed to how we got here. I don't know.
Okay. And could it also be, especially given the fact that the city was small, with few men in it, not capable of defending itself, that once it was over, this itty-bitty city went on with its life, the people inside it went on with its life, and people kind of just forgot. All right? If this had been Jerusalem, okay, or Babylon, or some major city, this man might have been exalted, and instead of being a poor wise man, he would have been a rich wise man and remembered for generations. But Solomon's ultimate conclusion to this is his wisdom is better than strength. That city had no strength. Wisdom beat the strength. Nevertheless, despite his wisdom, the poor man's wisdom is despised in the sense that it's not remembered and it wasn't rewarded. Okay, ultimately, his words are not heard. They were heard perhaps in the moment that saved the city, but in the long run, they were forgotten. Words of the wise spoken quietly should be heard rather than the shout of the ruler fools. Here's what I think Solomon's trying to get at with this. The value of wisdom, especially in the context of what he said, should it be all the more important for us to heed and pay attention and remember, given the nature of the fact that at any time anything could happen in our life? Okay, so Solomon, it's almost like he's trying to emphasize the importance of us listening to his wisdom, and not only that, but to wisdom in general. Okay, there's that part of it. That, listen, the things that I've told you, and really this goes all the way back to chapter 1, but especially in its immediate context, the importance of making now matter and using it to serve God rather than living just under the sun. In the end, don't be like these people who came after, who forgot the poor wise man's words. And yet this poor wise man, he wasn't remembered. But there's also a secondary aspect, okay, or an additional one that I thought about. Is it also true that when we take up the words of wisdom and we try to share them with others, are they always going to be heard? Are they always going to be remembered? And should we accept that ahead of time? Because isn't it frustrating when we know we have, and take the scriptures away from it for a moment, just from the perspective of wisdom in general. Okay, whether it be wisdom based on experience, I've been there, I've done this, guys, this is not going to work. You really ought to tie that down because I'm telling you that some bad's going to happen. People don't listen. okay, the rashness of youth, whatever, okay? And I told you that was going to happen, okay? People don't listen, and sometimes even if they do listen, they don't remember it for later application, all right? Knowing that ahead of time can save us a lot of frustration. Did everybody listen to the wisdom of Solomon? Of all people, Solomon understood. Sometimes he didn't even listen to his own wisdom, right? But the concept of this is that, listen, sometimes the poor wise man needs to be heard and paid attention to, whether we're the hearer or the giver. Either way, what's the heart from which it's coming? And to me, this emphasizes the poor aspect. I suggest to you Solomon is the poor wise man. But he wasn't poor. So in what way is he emphasizing the poor aspect of the poor wise man? In what way should wisdom be given? What attitude? In humility. Yeah, humble. In a lot of ways, that's kind of how I see Solomon relating himself in this equation. It's not that Solomon was poor. He was rich, beyond our wildest dreams. But it's the concept of in humility. Recognizing some people might listen, some people might not, but in the end, your words, they may last for a while, for a season, but in the end, they're going to be forgotten. And ultimately, is it really about you? Solomon doesn't name this poor old man, does he? And to that end, this city didn't remember him after a while. No matter how wise we are, no matter what that our wisdom may lead to, good for everybody, will we ultimately be remembered? No. Within its context, this goes back to the importance of listening to the wisdom of Solomon, but also when we take on that wisdom and we try to share it with others, recognize that some people aren't going to listen. Words of the wise spoken quietly should be heard. I think Solomon's speaking for himself and for us, rather than the shout of a ruler of fools. Have you ever had a type of person who, and I know we've all known individuals like this, who are very quiet, okay, very quiet people. Not that they're shy necessarily, but they just don't have a lot to say most of the time. But when they do open their mouth, everything they say has substance. You ever known someone like that? And you kind of describe them to others as, they don't talk a lot, but when they do talk, listen up, because what they're going to say is well thought out, well considered. All right. We've all known people like that. Yeah, I know, exactly. We've all known people like that. That's why verse 18, wisdom is better than weapons of war, but one sinner destroys much good. In the case of this small little city, wisdom beat this great king and his snares, his siege of the city. But one sinner can destroy all of it. One fool, one person whose voice is louder, one person who may say, he's a poor fella, don't listen to him, he doesn't know what he's talking about. Obviously, because poor people should, if he's wise, he should be rich, right? So since he's poor, obviously his wisdom doesn't mean very much. That's that thought process. Okay? Listen to what is being said. Not necessarily who is saying it. Listen to what's being said and take it for the wisdom that it is. Nolan.
Two comments, if I may. One, this man had wisdom prior. He's going to have it after.
Mm-hmm.
He was neglected. It's only in the time of desperation when last straw, we're going to give ear to this poor guy, hey, well, it's a good idea to save us, but then we don't need him anymore.
Yeah, cast him off again.
There's a point there about, as you're saying, listening to it. As far as the being remembered or not, you might check this morning's comics page. Pearls Before Swine, there's a great story about a guy who has done everything. They built the legacy park in his honor. He's telling someone about it, has a heart attack, dies. Here comes the bulldozer, and they build a new Starbucks and Dunkin' Donuts in his place.
And it just goes to show that nothing lasts. And yeah, I think that's a great application to think about the fact that often the foolish, they may pick up their ears for a minute when it's last resort, in the moment, okay, and then as soon as that crisis is over, we just kind of keep on going on the way we were, which led to our initial situation, right? So yeah, that's a great application from that too. Yeah. And really, and you know, to be clear, I think that the specific connection between what he said before and what he's saying now is the recognition, listen, I can repeat this over and over again. You can repeat this over and over again. But people, there's going to be a lot of people who aren't going to take to heart the fact that a living dog is better than a dead lion. They're just not going to take it to heart. They're not going to really consider their state under the sun. But that's why wisdom sees the perspective. Wisdom is objective. It sees what's important, the priorities in this life. And the foolish, they don't really pay attention. They listen to the one who's the loudest, the one who has the power, the money. They don't listen to the humble or the meek very often. Anything else through verse 18? Yes, sir.
Just a specific example in our modern time is the gender equality movement, the loudness of that. I mean, it's so much attention, media, the loudness of fools versus the quietness of wisdom.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. And a lot of the problems that stem from that line of thinking, the ultimate kind of the snowball effect of it, people don't really look ahead, right? That's one of the things that Solomon describes too, is thinking about the end result of things. That's what wisdom considers, not just the initial moment, but how this is going to wind up. Solomon himself said that. Now, some things we can't know, but there's a certain amount of wisdom that can say, hey, if we continue along this path, this is how things are going to go. And wisdom kind of falls into that equation. Anything else through verse 18? All right. So we'll be able to get into chapter 10 just for a few minutes before our second bell rings. Chapter 10, verse 1. Dead flies putrefy the perfumer's ointment and cause it to give off a foul odor. So does a little folly to one respected for wisdom and honor. A wise man's heart is at his right hand, but a fool's heart at his left. Even when a fool walks along the way, he lacks wisdom, and he shows everyone that he's a fool. So Solomon, again, branching off into this concept of wisdom again, he's going to describe, and remember that kind of give and take, the two sides of that. Solomon says, hey, listen to what I'm saying, but also understand that if you speak wisdom, people aren't going to listen to you most of the time. All right, well, now carry that a little bit further. You're the one speaking wisdom. He says, dead flies putrefy or stink up the perfumer's ointment, cause it to give off a foul odor. So does a little folly to one respected for wisdom and honor. There's two ways in which he's using this. What are the dead flies? Okay, folly. And in what way can someone of wisdom allow folly into their life? Okay, somebody who's respected. Notice he says, one respected for wisdom, he has a reputation. Someone who is well known for their wisdom, for their religious convictions, say. Okay, how can we throw, or what can cause dead flies to stink up our ointment, so to speak? Okay, bad choices, foolishness on our own part, but also allowing ourselves to mingle with or be with those who are foolish, okay, causing us to lead into folly as well. All right, and we'll pick that up next Sunday. Thank you, everybody, for the thoughts and comments.